July 1st, 1980 was the day the less-than-truckload carrier industry changed. It was the day that President Jimmy Carter signed into law the Motor Carrier Act of 1980. Years of familiar trucking companies rolling down the highways between terminals on regulated routes had come to an end. The door was open to welcome in thousands of new companies with a different business model to reshape the trucking industry. Gone was the Interstate Commerce Commission. Gone were the certificates of public convenience and necessity, that valuable asset that gave trucking companies authority to operate. Gone was the need for terminals, dock workers, and the movement of freight between massive break bulk terminals on acres of paved lots. The entrance door was open wide. Carriers of truckload freight could take shipments from point A to point B directly, using any route. No-touch freight, they called it. Rate cutting took over, thus putting the squeeze on existing motor freight carriers. The result to survive for LTL carriers meant one of two things: expand to cover new areas or merge with others. Money-losing trucking companies joined forces in hopes of lowering expenses by the term economies of scale. It was soon discovered that combining too many losers resulted in a much larger money loser. These companies choosing to expand found they were soon competing with others doing the exact same thing. Deregulating the trucking industry wasn't a new idea, as it had been talked about for several years. The airline industry had been changed and new budget airlines came and went. It would be similar to what the trucking industry would be like. To further illustrate, let's look at how deregulation affected the airlines. But while listening to this, imagine the trucking industry instead of airlines, and you'll see the same thing happen. In 1978, Congress passed a law allowing airlines to set their own fares and routes, and President Jimmy Carter signed it into law. Deregulation spurred the creation of dozens of new airlines and prompted many smaller ones to expand. People Express, New York Air, and other airlines were formed. Local and regional airlines also expanded. Eastern, Braniff, Delta, and others extended their networks to compete with the largest carriers. Deregulation also lifted restrictions on where airlines could fly. In the early 1980s, many airlines had overexpanded and were flying for a share of a decreasing market. Some went bankrupt. The effects of the trucking industry were similar to that of the airlines. Mergers of several large carriers resulted in eventually those same merged companies shutting down. PIE and Ryder, Roadway Express and Yellow all became fallen flags. A few regional carriers grew into nationwide lines that survived. Among them, Saya Freight, Estes Express Lines, and Old Dominion Freight Line. A majority of the rest either shut down within months of regulation or lasted a few years later. Johnson Motor Lines of Charlotte, North Carolina was among the first to call it quits. Branch Motor Express lasted 4 years until their lender called millions of dollars of loans due and immediately payable. Branch shut the doors in August 1984 after 4 years of losses. Prior to deregulation, Branch had been profitable for decades. There were other effects of the Motor Carrier Act of 1980. Tens of thousands of employees having to find other employment, hundreds of truck terminals of various sizes becoming available and would end up being vacant for several years as being too large for the ever-shrinking base of remaining carriers to use. Some of the former terminals would be adapted for other uses. The previous Acres Motor Lines terminal and maintenance shop in Charlotte, North Carolina, became a parking lot for the nearby airport. Less than 2 hours away in Greensboro, Branch Motor Express had used 2 breakbulk terminals through their years in the city. The first one became vacant when Branch moved across town in the late 1970s. They moved into the former Hemingway Transport Barn. When Leeway Motor Freight expanded operations into the southeast United States, a small terminal was established in the old Branch location. After Leeway folded, the former building stood empty for several years until ABC Building Supply Distributor adapted the terminal and moved in. After moving to the former Hemingway location, Branch stayed in Greensboro, but now that terminal is now a pallet supply company, and stacks of shipping pallets are all over the parking lot. How did the industry get to this point? At what point in time did it appear that the trucking industry go over the cliff toward deregulation? Let's look back and reflect on what led to it. It won't take long. Besides, this is about taking regulations away, not putting them in force. Prior to the 1910s, a few short years before World War I, the railroads had a monopoly on transportation in the country. Towns and cities had long established along the tracks laid across the land. Both freight and passengers made the railroad industry big and powerful. As manufacturing factories and stores started and grew, so did the need to transport products from there to the rail depots. That's where horse-drawn carriages and freight wagons began being used. The men who led those horse teams were known as teamsters. In the early days, those same men formed sole proprietorships or even incorporated their businesses that were called express or transfer companies. These teaming enterprises spurred up everywhere. In Chicago, where all the major railroads met and interchanged freight, there were hundreds of teaming companies. Some handled only the transfer of passengers' baggage going from one railroad to another. Other expressors dealt in only freight. The coordination between rail and teamsters worked efficiently until the newfangled motor truck arrived on the scene. The motor vehicle soon was adapted to being used not only as a truck but also as a bus to carry people. Both uses began to draw revenues away from the monopoly that the railroad industry had enjoyed. Teamsters became truckers, and as the motor carrier adapted into bigger and more powerful vehicles to handle increased tonnage, it drew away further business from railroads. At first, railroads tried using trucks themselves to haul freight between shorter distances from station to station, leaving the longer runs for the trains. Same with buses. The men operating the new businesses charged whatever they wanted and went wherever they could transport freight to. As better roads came along during the 1920s, the individual states worried about how to tax the trucks using the roads, whether by a per mile tax that would help maintain the highways or a tax on each gallon purchased within the state as fuel. To rein in the emerging trucking industry, states all over the country started regulating where trucks could go, the rates charged, and handed out certificates of operating convenience to provide fairness in competition. To show how far-reaching the states oversaw transportation, let's look at how Iowa did it. The Iowa Board of Railroad Commissioners was established in 1878. The Railroad Commission began licensing railways, then several years later, trucks were under regulation, starting with interstate carriers. Then, as motor freight became more interstate, they began regulating them as well. It was the same with the Interstate Commerce Commission, starting at overseeing railroads, then trucks and buses. Okay, that's enough for how we got to being regulated. Now let's delve into the deregulation of the industry. Looking back at the big picture, there was not just one thing that made everyone in power say, let's deregulate trucks. Rather, several events taking place slowly over several decades made it happen. At the end of World War II, the U.S. was the powerhouse of industry throughout the world. European countries and others in the Pacific Rim lay in ruins and had to be rebuilt with the newest technology, manufacturing methods that were more efficient than before. This set the stage for making products with less people at a cheaper cost. You can watch it happen from the late 1940s through today. During the 1940s and through the 50s, we made TVs here and other entertainment goods. By the 1970s, stereo equipment with brand names of Kenwood, Sony, and Pioneer were being built in Japan. The oil embargo of the 1970s didn't help the automobile industry. That was the era of muscle cars with big engines. What few small cars made here could not compete with the Japanese imports with gas-sipping engines. During the 1970s and 80s, factories were being consolidated. Instead of the old practice of industrial plants producing goods on a regional basis. Now it was fewer plants shipping truckloads across the country. This put a squeeze on the LTL motor carriers, who were used to picking up smaller shipments. New contract carriers were established that thrived in just in time delivering. Applications for authority still had to be approved, as the ICC still ruled king over who could travel where. The wheels were turning to deregulate the trucking industry after what the government considered a success with what had been done with the airlines. Talk of deregulation drew fear with trucking companies. It wasn't enough that some of the weaker companies had already closed shop in the 1970s. Associated Transport shut down before 1980. That dreadful day in 1980 came and went and changed everything. Let's not forget the other issues that did not help. Striking employees caused IML Freight to shut down and declare bankruptcy. Some companies were bought cheaply, and the owners sold off assets in hope of making more money. This happened to pilot freight carriers and transcon lines. Other things that contributed to the demise of many trucking companies was the closing of auto plants and suppliers, the influx of Japanese cars, electronics, and cheap imports from other countries in the disguise of global trade. Big box retailers expanded, opening up thousands of stores across the country, selling imported goods to consumers who were only interested in price and not caring that they were actually destroying American jobs. Another nail in the coffin was entire industries leaving, such as textiles, clothing, and even manufacturing of TVs. Just decades before, dozens of companies made TVs here. Remember Zenith? So there you have it. More reasons that helped. Thanks for watching.